Dr. Kayden, we can start now.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. It's a great invitation to come to Cairo and see what's happening in this great city of yours and to learn from the experiences here. And I'd particularly like to thank Beth and Omar and Imen, and also, by the way, the simultaneous translators back there. Hi, guys. They're doing a great job, really, and we appreciate it very, very much. So, surprise of surprises, we've learned that public space is always deeply contested space. And of course, how could it be otherwise? That's in the very nature of public space. The past several years in particular have demonstrated the difficulty of knowing for certain what rights individuals and groups have with regard to public space. Who owns public space matters, to be sure, but only to a point. A notorious case that I'll be discussing this morning, arising out of New York City, amply illustrates this ambiguity and complexity. You have all heard of Occupy Wall Street or any of the Occupy movements, which in New York was one of the earliest and most famous manifestations of the worldwide Occupy movement. And Occupy Wall Street as a group took over, listen to this, a privately owned public space. And at least for a while, enjoyed greater rights in that privately owned public space than it would have enjoyed in a publicly owned city park right next to City Hall several blocks away. How can private property provide greater rights than public property? Who and what determines the nature of rights to public space? Well, I'm going to use this case study of Occupy Wall Street not to sell it, not to convince you that this is the way to go, but to illustrate how diverse ownerships, city governance structures, civil society participation, and typologies of public space all can lead to diverse outcomes anywhere in the world. I think it's fair to say that in the future, people will look back at the past several years as vivid reminders of the place and power of physical space. And I have heard the cry from several people in the audience, what about people? Why are we talking about buildings? Why are we talking about physical things? What about people? And I think we're all sympathetic to that. In fact, we're all people. Of course we're sympathetic to that. But I think we also know, certainly we as planners and urban designers and architects and landscape architects, that the built environment plays a hugely important role in affecting the productivity, the equality, and the enjoyment of life of all individuals. And if we in this profession do a better job of shaping that built environment, the vessel of all of our aspirations, then in fact at the end of the day, the end, which is people, will be served by a better means, which is a better built environment. And that certainly goes for public space. Well, here's Zuccotti Park in New York, which is going to be my case study. This is Occupy London, right outside of St. Paul's. Occupy Central in Hong Kong. Occupy Boston. This is right next to where I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is Gezi Park and Taksim Square, of course, in Istanbul. I'm not quite sure what this is. No, I guess. And this is, of course, also a very, very famous public space that get occupied. Now, physical public space actually comes in many flavors. There are streets and sidewalks. This is in part streets and sidewalks. There are squares. This is partially squares. There are parks and plazas and public libraries and community centers. And even many would argue private shopping malls and shopping centers and hotel lobbies and cafes, which could be conceived by some as public space. Whatever flavor the public space comes in, they all have multiple ambitions and capabilities. First, although not most important, they provide enjoyment for casual and recreational activities. Second, they can promote democratization. maybe accommodate democratization, but they can even promote it from time to time. Third, they can promote equality. They can provide a place for somebody to enjoy who would otherwise not have access to such a place. And public spaces perform an enormously important role in ensuring, or at least moving, equality in the right direction. And today, we talk about public spaces as performing certain environmental functions. For example, in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, their plazas, when they are flooded, hold water during the period of the flood. So these are very ambitious and complicated places. So I want to have a picnic with my family and friends, exercise, fly a kite, read a book, demonstrate politically, skateboard, or sleep. And all of those activities, can and should be accommodated somewhere in public space. Now, interestingly, the very pluralism of public space can actually be overwhelming. Those interested in public space often speak past each other, what I would call a modern-day Tower of Babel. So there is the language of the theorists, and for those of you who are theory-oriented, you'll know about Lefebvre, and Harvey, and Mitchell, and Habermas, and Castells, and Foucault, and Soja, and Benjamin. Our own Benjamin is right here. Walter Benjamin is Omar, taking us around to passageways. And that's just as naming a few of the theorists. There's the language of the designers. We just heard from a designer. Too often, although not in this case, derivative, by the way, of the language of the theorists. There is the language of the environmental determinists who believe if we get public space right, it will improve outcomes. There is the language of the do-it-yourselfers, the DIYs, placing 1,000 chairs in Tahrir Square and see what happens. And I know you're thinking, well, I know what's going to happen. They'll be stolen or they'll be this or that. But these are experiments that are happening everywhere around the world with temporary installations, the kinetic city, the temporary city, guerrilla urbanism. It goes under a lot of different names, and it's the most popular movement today, thinking about urbanity in terms of temporality in addition to permanent structures. There's the language of the daily user of the space, and the language of the homeless person, and the language of the private owners, and the language of government officials, and the language of the political activists, which brings me to the subject of my talk today. And all of them have a claim, exercise a claim on public space. So no, there's no such thing as a non-political public space, but there's no such thing necessarily as exclusively a political public space. They do all of these things. So let's take a look at Occupy Wall Street and its occupation. A lot of actors here, the members of Occupy Wall Street, otherwise known as public space users, the owner of the public space, various agencies and officials of the city of New York, the court system, ultimately judges, neighbors, who were none too happy as the occupation continued, and other members of the public. So this is it. Obviously not in its Occupy mode. This is Zuccotti Park, and as I said, it's not a city-owned park. In fact, I don't even really call it a park, but it was named a park after one of the officials at the private company that owns this space. And the space is privately owned, and yet it's right in the middle of New York City, and it is open and accessible to the public by law. And that's why it's called a privately owned public space, what I sometimes refer to as law's oxymoronic invention, hot snow. In the old days in the United States, we would say military intelligence, things that don't exactly match up. Zuccotti Park today is one of 530 plazas, arcades, and other outdoor and indoor spaces in the city of New York, all of which, by law, are open and accessible to the public. Some of them 24 hours a day, sometimes from dusk till dawn. But the public has the right to use these spaces even though they're privately owned. And by the way, let's not worry too much about the harm to the developer or the owner, because in fact, the owner was able to build a larger building than he or she otherwise would have been allowed to build under the law in return for the agreement to provide the space. No owner is required to do this. It is a voluntary decision. And let me tell you, these spaces are at roughly 330 buildings. So clearly we have a sense that the deal of building larger in return for providing the space is a good deal for the owners. One question is it a good deal for the public? Privately owned public spaces, sometimes known as POPs, exist worldwide, by the way. They're not a New York phenomenon alone. They started in New York, but you'll find them in Seoul, South Korea. They have 1,000 of them. In Hong Kong, in Tokyo, in Vancouver, in Toronto, and Melbourne, and you can just go around the world. They exist. But obviously, they're connected in the main to larger residential towers or larger office towers, as opposed to a single-family house. So all of these are in very, very large buildings at the base. The buildings may be 50,000 square meters or 100,000 square meters. And there's the plaza or the arcade or other space. This one happens to be next to the building. It's a sort of unusual condition. So Zuccotti Park, it's about a quarter-hectare plaza with trees, sitting area, and lighting that is indeed required to be accessible to the public at all times. So interestingly, in addition to what I just said of open at all times, these were the only rules that the owner posted at the space immediately prior to its occupation by Occupy Wall Street. So I'm looking at the rules. Okay, I can't skateboard at the space, I can't rollerboard, and I can't bicycle at the space. And you could say, well, why are they allowed to do this? Well, we don't really know, but they set some rules for themselves, and these were the rules. Notice it doesn't say no political demonstration, no picnics, no parties, no this, no that. That's what it was, because they just never anticipated this. So the owners were stunned when this actually happened. You know, suddenly their space, a quarter of a hectare, is occupied by a political movement. And incidentally, were they occupying against the owners of this building? It was called Occupy Wall Street, so it was against the neoliberal state, if you will, against capitalism and not against government. And they were part of the neoliberal capital state, but they hadn't really done anything wrong specifically, and indeed they were providing this park. So, as I said, interestingly, Occupy Wall Street enjoyed more rights in this space, which is privately owned, than in a city-owned park. So let's just take a quick look at Occupy Wall Street. I just want to give you a flavor of it. This is when it was happening. We are Tunisia, Egypt, Greece, Palestine, Spain, Yemen, Chile, Bahrain, Syria, Bolivia, and on and on. If you were from another country, you should feel left out. We are the 99%. Corporations aren't people. Stop robbing from the middle class to pay the rich. I know you don't have any of these problems here. Mr. President, tear down this wall. This I like. Notice that it's pronounced capitalism, not humanism. All right. So, and they organized a little city or village. Very interesting in terms of their spatial organization. So they had a public relations or information booth. These were the two women that sort of ran it. When I asked for their names, they said, sorry, we don't provide names. They had a daily weather forecast and news bulletin. Steve Jobs, Apple Computers, dead at 56 on the day that I was there. They had their own newspaper, very clever, the Occupied Wall Street Journal. You've all heard of the Wall Street Journal. And they distributed that. They had news going around the world, outreach. Unions, labor unions were there. They had a library. They gave out free food. Sort of reminds me of our catered lunch, Beth, yesterday. Sorry, Beth. Haircuts, a barber shop. People were sleeping there and enjoying the space. They had an artist who would allow you to write on his board. Music, sort of the nihilism of some music. You always have that guy there in a gas mask. This is a newscaster, newscasts around the world. This is a political candidate who was running for president of the United States at the time. He didn't win, by the way. And then just the regular activities of public space. Sandwich, chess, yoga, and just hanging around and talking. Now, surrounding the space on the publicly owned streets and sidewalks was a very different presence. By the way, the building that it was attached to, which is a very tall 50-story building, is right there, One Liberty Plaza, an ironic name for the building. And there's the police. And here are the police on the sidewalks. And without getting into it deeply, you had more rights inside Zuccotti Park than on the sidewalk of New York. So there was this very interesting interaction back and forth. And when you would stop on the sidewalk, this police would say, you can't stop, go into the space, stay there, that's fine, but you can't stop on the sidewalk. And you can see it all around. Now, I mentioned a city-owned park. This is City Hall Park in New York, immediately next to City Hall. These photos were taken by me literally at the exact same time as Occupy Wall Street, 2 minutes later. Beautiful park, very quiet, peaceful. And here are the rules for City Hall Park, and without going through them, yes, they have skateboarding issues and all that kind of stuff, but the biggest rule is the park is closed at night, every night. And by the way, if you want to protest, you have to get a permit from the city. So Occupy Wall Street either brilliantly or serendipitously chose a space where they had more rights than, in fact, public space. Okay, so let's go back then. Here are the Zuccotti Park rules immediately before Occupy Wall Street occupied them. And here are the rules that the owner posted about 2 weeks after Occupy Wall Street occupied the space. Now they say, no tents, no lying down on the ground, no placement of tarps. In other words, the owner changed the rules. And you could say, can it do that? And the answer is, I don't know, I'm not sure. Nobody is sure because the law is ambiguous on this. Well, it went to the city of New York. The owner said, now that they're violating our new rules, all of these people are in violation of our property rights. They're trespassing. You call the police came, and they removed all of Occupy Wall Street. It finally went to court, and the judge agreed with the owner of the space, saying the rules of Occupy Wall Street in the space were unreasonable. The rules of the owners were, in fact, reasonable. So, in conclusion, let me give you 3 observations from this case, I think. First, the occupation itself was actually what I would call political speech. It was a core element of the speech. The space was not just accommodating people, and then they were speaking out on other issues. It was actually representing a kind of physical community that was somewhat utopian for them. Second, for Occupy Wall Street, transgressive occupation was a core element of the speech. That is to say, disobeying the law was part of their speaking. Here, by the way, is where it is now, but this is Speaker's Corner in London. They don't want to occupy Speaker's Corner in London because they're allowed to occupy it. They wanted to occupy a space that they couldn't occupy. So, by the way, that has important implications about design. I hear from a lot of designers, why don't we design space for political protest? And I said, I'm not sure you exactly get the idea of what political protest may in fact mean. The third and final comment, should rules for public space demand spatial pluralism? Occupy Wall Street took over this space for weeks and weeks and weeks, and I couldn't use it really. I mean, I could, I walked around, but you were enveloped in their program, their project, their activity. And one might wonder whether after a certain amount of time, whether even the noblest of purposes, political protest, begins to give way to someone who just wants to eat a sandwich in the space. So think about this. Large conversation that we need to have about how public spaces are used. Maybe there's a human right to public space, and we ought to think about that. But no matter what, there's no such thing as a non-political public space because politics is in everything, and that's finally what makes our public spaces so vibrant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kayden.